Hello, I'm Chris Holdaway, and just for a bit of context, it's the 28th of October 2015, and we are here in the Julian Samora Library for the Institute of Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. And I'm here to interview Roberto Tejada, a poet, translator, editor, essayist. He's the author of 5 collections of poetry, including Full Foreground from the University of Arizona Press, 2012, and Mirrors for Gold, Krupskaya, 2006. He's also written books about art, especially photography, and it seems more often than not his academic appointments have actually been in the art and art history departments than literature. So I'd like to thank you for being a part of our Oral Histories program here at Notre Dame.
Thank you.
And just for the purposes of documentation, we ask everyone this, don't worry, could you please tell me your full name, date and place of birth, and where you are living today?
So my full name is Roberto José Tejada Montoya. I was born on January 19th, 1964 in Los Angeles, California, and I currently live in the city of Houston, Texas, where I teach at the University of Houston.
Okay, so you've confirmed what all the biography notes tell me. Born in 1964 in LA, but I feel like LA is a really big place.
Yes.
So I wondered if you could sketch, your particular corner, what it was like for your childhood there.
So my parents moved around before I was about 10, but I grew up ultimately in what I consider my house on 142 South Arden Boulevard, which is in Hancock Park near Larchmont, a sort of now commercial area, and broadly I would consider part of Hollywood in the city of Los Angeles. Los Angeles in the 70s, and I can distinctly remember that street and its stop signs. You would still see bumper stickers or posters about MIAs and prisoners of war, POWs and MIAs. So the Vietnam War was still looming, and in the media, of course. But it was a time in which, that area of Los Angeles is now has been so valued as to exclude any kind of immigrant middle class. But at the time, it was a place in which my parents, who are Colombian and who emigrated to the United States in the late 50s, were able to buy a home. And the grammar school that I went to, St. Brendan's, was composed quite remarkably by, I'd say, about a third of my class were sons or daughters of Latinos from Mexico, from Ecuador, from Peru. I remember their names distinctly. So you had Cibel Sierra from Ecuador, and Rosemary Bagdash, Edmund Koblenz, whose parents were Costa Rican, Eddie Zubiari, whose parents were Peruvian, and so forth. Yet it was still very much, if you read or look to Mike Davis's books on Los Angeles, Ecology of Fear and others, very much still a kind of Anglo middle class. So it was a kind of an aspiring middle class. So it was that kind of Los Angeles that had a time in which you could actually use public transportation, as I did until I owned a car, to get to downtown or to the ocean, to Santa Monica, to Hollywood. And the city became very important to me, especially as I started inching toward adolescence.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Come back to that in a second. You mentioned moving around a bit. So what were some of the other significant locations of your childhood? So
within Los Angeles, I'd have to do a kind of theater of memory to exactly remember the geographies, but they were in what would now be, actually I remember I think the first house that they rented was in what is now Koreatown.
Okay.
And the second was basically East Hollywood.
But so for the most part, things still in the greater Los Angeles?
Yes, within basically the core of LA.
Okay, interesting. And do you still have a strong connection to Los Angeles? I don't know whether personally with family or through your artistic or academic work. Like, does it still feature I feel like it has a strong psychogeography. I mean, everywhere does, but
it does for me particularly. I mean, my immediate family moved from Los Angeles in the 90s, and they all emigrated to the great city of Buffalo, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I have uncles and aunts and cousins who live in Southern California, and an aunt in particular who still lives in Glendale in LA. And for me it's an important kind of sentimental education and psychogeography that informs the way I think about cities, and I'm very comfortable in cities that have the kind of grid or lack of grid, sort of the open form city of places like Houston, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned public transport, and I think today is something that one doesn't necessarily think of Los Angeles when you think of public transport, perhaps.
No, but since I don't live there, but
yeah.
I have taken the Metro, and it's quite effective as one would, contrary to popular belief.
Right, exactly. I think you talked about some of the differences that you perceive in maybe like the demographics of this area that you grew up in. For want of a better term, if we call that a real difference, which seems like an overextension, but what's maybe something I'm interested in, maybe something that you feel is different now just through your perception, like maybe it hasn't changed all that much? Does that make sense as a question?
That is, today, that part of the city, has it changed?
Yeah, that may be a perceived difference rather just through your aging or...
I mean, I think it has changed because the world has changed and neoliberalism has made cities basically only accessible to the 1%.
Mm-hmm.
And that part of Los Angeles was intimately tied to the film and media industries. So even some of my classmates were also sons or daughters of those who worked in the film industry.
Right. Interesting.
But today, I mean, that part of Los Angeles is, considered a very sort of triple A for
Mm-hmm.
real estate, and
Mm-hmm.
but the change of the, I mean, in terms of its built environment, it hasn't changed very much. There's something about Los Angeles that even though it goes through all kinds of material transformations, there's a kind of mood to the city, the way in which it interacts, the way in which you have to transit by way of a car that you're always interacting,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes less intensely so than others, with other sectors of the city and the kind of demographics and cultures that those areas represent.
And so with this kind of change that things like neoliberalism have enacted, and you said the city became sort of very acutely important to you as you entered into adolescence. This might be a really unfair question, but how sort of politically aware do you think you were of that kind of change as someone growing up there?
Well, at that time, it was only in its early stages. I mean, I do remember when Ronald Reagan was elected into the presidency in 1980. And at that point, politically, my interventions or actions were in the kind of underground world of the music scene in Los Angeles.
Right, okay.
I was... and incredibly that my parents would let me go out at night during weekdays, would be going to many of the music clubs in Hollywood and in East LA, where some of the bands that I was interested in. And this became my kind of initiation into underground or avant-garde culture. I mean, at the time, there are now names that, that most would recognize, but, with my pals, my sister and others, we were going to hear, John Doe and Exene of X, or Tito Larriva of The Plugs, a lesser-known band that was one of my favorites, Juan Gomez of the Human Hands, and
So
and
kind of
others, yeah.
Cultural code that you've found yourself.
Yeah, and it was a way of also transiting the city and feeling that you belonged to it in some kind of way, even if it was, as I later would read, the Chicano artist and writer Harry Gamboa Jr. would call. We were all kind of orphans of modernity, right? We were learning to be modern, but we weren't quite wanting to be to enter exactly into the mainstream. So we lived at the margins, or kind of created kind of community, a recognition in these in these, and a kind of hierarchy of taste
Mm-hmm.
in this sort of subscene.
Interesting. Maybe we can come back to Asco and Gamboa
For
Jr.
example,
later
yeah.
on. I'm wondering, so when did you first leave the cradle of either your parents' home or leave Los Angeles to live somewhere else?
So I left Los Angeles. I only applied to one university, and I got in, and I went to NYU,
right.
for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I began actually in what was then the School of the Arts. I thought I very much, I was already writing poetry, but I thought I wanted to be a dramaturg. I thought I wanted to be a playwright.
Mm-hmm.
So I entered into the Tisch School of the Arts, but very quickly found out that was really not my vocation. And I switched into comparative literature, which was in their College of Arts and Sciences.
Mm-hmm. So that was actually my next question, is when you sort of came to your first designs on writing, and so it was before college.
It was before college.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel lucky that I grew up in a place like Los Angeles, so I was interacting even in high school with the kind of sub-scenes that were also in keeping with the punk and new music scene,
Mm-hmm.
In places like Beyond Baroque, which was in the Venice jail, which has turned into a cultural center.
Mm-hmm.
There would be, so John Doe and Exene Cervenka were actually, they met there, and they were poets before they became musicians.
Right.
And I'm trying to think of some of the other writers who would have been involved in that, the magazine Little Caesar and others. And then, and I was writing in high school and involved in the sort of the high school literary magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that I really began to write seriously once I was at university. And I remember taking a workshop as an undergraduate with Galway Connell, who was there at the in the MFA program, and he kindly allowed me to take part in this graduate seminar. And then a workshop at the YWHA with a poet who I'm glad to be still in infrequent but in contact with, Michael Burkhardt, who teaches at Syracuse now, and it was not quite well known at the time, but whose aesthetic really aligned with the kind of work that I eventually became interested in. And I remember very clearly I was at the St. Mark's the St. Mark's bookstore, and I found a copy of Sulphur magazine, edited by Clayton Eshelman, out of Los Angeles at the time. And so I wrote to him and offered my services as in an internship that I would, over the summer, since I would be going back to Los Angeles, I ended up working on their archives and putting some material into order for that magazine.
And you would later go on to found your own kind of
Yes.
ventures like that. Just before we go to there, after the undergraduate study at NYU, you went on to later do a PhD in what I've heard is interdisciplinary media studies at the SUNY Buffalo. And so we've heard about your involvement in sort of underground music, wanting to be a playwright first, also finding that maybe poetry was your thing, and then we know that later on you will write extensively in the visual arts. So I wonder if you could unpack a little bit about what this PhD study was as a way of understanding all the different media that come together for you.
So there's a large gap in time between the time I graduated from NYU and when I began my PhD studies.
Right.
So that important 10-year period is when I moved to Mexico
City, yeah.
And it's in Mexico City where I first worked for the arts magazine Vuelta, published by the late Nobel laureate Octavio Paz for several years. And then I was recruited to an arts magazine, Artes en Mexico, where I worked for several years. And it was there that I began to translate art criticism and art history for the magazine and began to write art pieces of my own. Mm-hmm. And I was largely influenced by someone like Octavio Paz, who was both an astounding essayist and had a very keen visual sense of the ultimate meanings of visual objects, mm-hmm. and the fundamental nature of them in conjunction with writing in terms of the kind of historic motion, right? Mm-hmm. The setting into motion a sort of historic view of arts and writing. So that's where I began to write and publish about art. So that after my 10 years in Mexico, I moved back to the States, worked briefly as a photography curator, and I'm looking at this photograph, which I believe is by Antonio Turok, because I worked for an archive of Mexican and Southwest photography before accepting the offer at SUNY Buffalo to pursue my PhD. And I mean, I don't think I would have been able to do my PhD in any other circumstance. I mean, SUNY Buffalo has been largely and long associated with all kinds of experimental practice and experimental pedagogies, and involved in the intense contemporary art world as well. And so it was a place I was in the English department and a fellow traveler with the Poetics program that was run by Charles Bernstein and Susan Howe primarily, and others. And yet I was able to work with faculty in the comparative literature department, primarily feminists like Elizabeth Gross, and my thesis director, who was Joan Kopchak, who writes about psychoanalysis and its meaning in terms of visual representation and sort of media specificity.
Mm-hmm. So what drew you to Mexico in that sort of intervening period between undergraduate and graduate study?
You know, in the I would never recommend this to any undergraduate today, but at the time one could easily not go into graduate studies. Mm-hmm. In other words, and it was kind of discouraged by certain of my mentors, and it was having grown up in Los Angeles, Mexico was always part of my urban imaginary, or Mexico City was part of my urban imaginary. My parents took me there when I was young, and I think between 10 and 12, and I had always had this desire to go to Mexico City, and it was through a friend of mine and the translator of Octavio Paz, Elliot Weinberger, who facilitated the introduction, so that I sort of knocked on the door and sort of interviewed with Octavio, who then invited me to work for his journal.
And you also founded your own journal there, Mandorla.
Yes. So then once I had, even though I continued to be Octavio Paz's on and off and informal personal secretary for many years, I was working then at Artes de Mexico, and the editors of that journal allowed me to sort of start my own magazine, using the resources, that is the design resources, and which, remember, this was old cut and paste conventional typography.
No Photoshop. No
Photoshop. Although we were just beginning to merge into that, and I distinctly remember having to learn that particular softwares at the time. Quark Express.
Okay.
was the name of one of them, and I was also immersed in a very vibrant intellectual scene that involved poets who were my age and visual artists some of them who were expats, some of them from the UK, some of them from the United States, from other parts of Latin America, and there were all kinds of makeshift venues for us to interact. And for me, this was a kind of true sort of vitality of my intellectual training. Really sort of points back to those years.
And so the Mandorla Journal is a kind of multilingual outfit. What was your original mission kind of for that? What sort of things were you looking for?
Well, I was very, very influenced by an important journal from the 60s and 70s, edited by Margaret Randall and Sergio Mondragon in Mexico City, which was my model. Margaret Randall, an American who went to live in Mexico and later in Cuba and elsewhere, and Sergio Mondragon, who was Mexican, published a journal. I think they published 3 to 4 issues a year that linked American poetry of, they say, New American poetry modality with peers in Mexico and Latin America. And it was in a bilingual format. Sometimes there would be translations, otherwise sometimes there wouldn't be, especially towards the end of that journal's life. so I took that as a model to begin the first issues of Mandorla, in which there were translations, but there were never face on face pagination of the original and the translated text. And my idea was also similar, to sort of to trace a commonality between American modernism and Latin American avant-gardes, and those of us who were, in our 20s at the time, eager to kind of keep that archive, to fuse and confuse that archive as one that was relevant to the hemisphere.
I like that, fuse and confuse. I'm going to hold on to that. So we're sort of jumping all around in chronology a bit here, but so what is called Volume 1 of Mandorla finishes in 1998, and then it goes on a little bit of a hiatus for a while, and then it follows you to a later appointment in 2007, where Volume 2 starts. We've got some co-editors now with the second volume. Has there been a significant sort of change in that mission, or are you doing anything like very differently to the original instantiation?
Well, I mean, I think what's great about the best journals is that they do transform, and they're self-changing as they are on the move, and in this case it was literally on the move. So there's a hinge issue, which was number 6, which was edited by my friend and colleague Esther Allen, and then there was again a smaller hiatus, but it was in around 2004 when I had met Kristen Dykstra at the University of Buffalo, and I had already interacted with Gabriel Bernal Granados, who was a colleague in Mexico City, and thanks largely to Chris's appointment at the Illinois State University and her willingness to sort of take the lead at the time, we restarted the magazine around 2007. There was a change just by the very nature that there were three of us who were primary editors. I would say also, now that it was based in the United States, there was also an interest at looking at that relationship of the hemisphere from a very distinct U.S. and U.S. Latino perspective. And I think because of the rise of the communication technologies, we were also in touch and in communication with many different kinds of writers, translators as well. And what I see happening towards the end of, or sort of in the latter issues of the journal, is that a kind of network of translators and U.S. Latino writers were approaching Mandorla, and an incredible kind of a synergy took place. So I think that is what kind of defines the kind of change. In addition to seeing how Latino aesthetic interacts with Asian American aesthetics or with an African American poetics, and towards the end we were looking at those kind of commonalities as a place of difference, insofar as we didn't see that kind of need in publication in the 21st century taking place in any other of the journals that we admired and interacted with.
That's really interesting. So, again, bouncing around as you tend to do, like after the PhD, and you had a postdoc appointment at Dartmouth College, so you then returned to Mexico to teach at the National Autonomous University for a bit?
During my year at Dartmouth, I taught through their program in Puebla. I had already taught when I was living in Mexico for 10 years. It was a time in which you didn't need necessarily the credential of a PhD to teach at the university level, and I was asked to teach actually 19th and 20th century literature at the UNAM, thanks to my friend and colleague Charlotte Broad, who asked me to sort of fill in for somebody who was not able to teach at the time, and it was really quite extraordinary, that possibility. The UNAM is one of these great state public institutions where you have, all kinds of students from very different backgrounds.
It's sort of lucky time-wise you could get an appointment with just a MFA in creative writing, and even those days, it used to be a terminal degree, and it feels like even that's not the case anymore. You need the PhD as well.
That's right. So that was just a contingent appointment, but later when I was at Dartmouth, I actually did teach in their foreign study abroad and foreign language study abroad in Puebla, and that was also quite an incredible experience insofar as it was now my charge to lead some young minds into not only language acquisition but also reading through some difficult literary text, and then kind of seeing their experience of Mexico through their eyes. And I remember we took trips to Mexico City, to the museums. The murals were very important to me at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and to them, since they studied at Dartmouth, that has the great Orozco mural at the Bakerberry Library. So that was another return to Mexico that had its particular interesting valence.
Right. So that was your teaching at the UNAM itself was during your first spell in
That's
Mexico.
right. That's
Okay,
right.
I think that's what I had wrong in the chronology. So your first monographs were collections of poetry. You've got a book called Gift and Verdict on Leroy Books in 1999. The one that I sort of feel like I've found is most talked about is Mirrors for Gold, which came out in 2006, which you, I understand, actually wrote in Mexico City or partially.
Yes.
During your second spell.
Yes.
So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the kind of cultural context of Mexico City or Mexico specifically that ends up in that book.
Yeah, I would say actually most of the book is written in Mexico, and it, as is true with most of my publications, there's a belatedness that I must encourage on some kind of
Mm-hmm.
level, or that I'm eager in exploring, because it doesn't appear until 2006. The book was meant to explore both a kind of the erotics of the couple in a place that has the kind of urban energy of Mexico City, but not just the urban energy that has, what's indelible about Mexico City is that you are in constant contact with at least three visible epochs of history, that is the pre-Columbian,
Mm-hmm.
the colonial, and the modern and contemporary. And I wanted to somehow address the idea of encounter, that is erotic encounter, but also historic encounter, so that what gets played out, I think, as one of the leitmotifs is how the bodies of the speaker and his beloved are sort of stand-ins or surrogates for the ways in which the violence of the encounter and conquest of the New World set into motion effects of desire, fear, and fantasy. And so it's a kind of looking at history on the one hand, but then looking at the third section of the book has very distinct poems that look at very specific sections of Mexico City, like one entitled Netzahualcoyotl, which is a very distant part of the city that at the time was disinvested and disenfranchised, but where there was also a very large flea market. And so to see the kind of underground economies of Mexico at the time kind of speaking to larger circulations of both objects and actors or people was something that I wanted to activate in that book. And of course, so the cover of that book has this image of Theodore de Bray, the 17th century engraver, which is a very perverse look, a European view of what indigenous peoples looked like, and the kind of fears of Europe that there was cannibalism in the New World, right?
All right. Well, I happen to have it with me, and I thought we could just get you to read one poem from the section that has the same title as the book, Mirrors for Gold, if you would oblige us.
Sure. So maybe I should just say about this long poem, which is in, I believe, 15 or 16 sections. This one is very much linked to my commitment to psychoanalysis. I was in psychoanalysis in Mexico for 4 years, and this comes out of the ways in which I was entering the kind of the darker side of one's personality and the darker side of one's psyche, but also the sort of thinking about the history of oneself as an individual through that kind of talking cure. and the uncertainties, I think, of the self that emerge from that kind of therapeutic. As if out into the open, where the earth trembled, was at once a room and not a room, the wall collapsing, though braced by an absence more powerful than any stone, he said to my mother, I was a cat among the garbage, and later the insurmountable shape of this wretched curtain, behind whose lush fabric we fucked until, at last, of increasingly more obdurate matter, as though 2 languages were scarcely enough. Yeah, so this also has this other theme, which is the inhabiting or the indwelling constantly of being in 2 languages, as was the case for myself in Mexico.
Great. Psychoanalysis is a word that's cropping up a lot in this little talk here, and I've got this quote which I found in another interview you did, and you were talking just now about psychoanalysis as the actual kind of clinical practice, not merely just a way of reading literature or cultural objects. And this quote that I found from another interview you did says, you're interested in how the relationship between self and other in a psychoanalytic sense can point to the violent encounter between the conquistador and Native American. Who's conquering whom, and how are these power differentials established in a palpable historical sense? And that, I just want to say the word palpable kind of really knocked my socks off here, when I find that so often in literary studies, like a psychoanalytic reading has often no goal other than being a psychoanalytic reading, and to bring that out into a palpable historic sense, and also to be interested in an actual clinical practice. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about your relationship to the program of psychoanalysis.
So at the time in Mexico, there was a great energy around psychoanalysis, in part because many psychoanalysts in Mexico at the time had trained either in Argentina or in Paris, and some of them, in fact, with Lacan. So there was among especially the cultural elite, an interest in psychoanalysis as an actual practice or as a mode. And though I was very resistant to it at the beginning, I found that the kinds of questions that it asked about the structure of the unconscious being commensurate with the structure of language was something very liberating. And so it was not only to sort of revisit the narratives that are usually associated with psychoanalysis, but actually looking very deeply at what happens when you are in the same space 3 times a week. Something happens to time and space and the way we think about history or storylines over the long duration of 4 years, for example. Mm-hmm. And of course, it could have been endless, insofar as theoretically one could say that there's never an end to psychoanalysis.
So you talk a bit about history there, and I wonder about the sort of scale that is involved in ideas of the self and the other, and the personal amidst like a tide of annihilating historical fact. I'm thinking about one poem in particular in Full Foreground, which has the line, a mother's cut a wall between siblings, near ideas of like insurrection. And how do you sort of negotiate this balancing act? Is it something you're consciously aware of?
Yes, because to look at the subject psychoanalytically is to also realize that there is the ultimate desire of freedom, that is, the desire to fulfill one's desires, is really the desire of the tyrant. So that it's not too large of a leap to think historically or ethically about the encounter between self and other as potentially, not only potentially, but being involved in a power relationship, mm-hmm. but being involved in the kind of power relationship that we see historically being produced over time, mm-hmm. and that one has both aspects of the tyrant and of the victim, and that one can identify historically with both, and one can't disabuse oneself of the fact that one has those tyrannical and violent urges and impulses that are generative of certain kinds of energies.
You mentioned the Debray engraving that's on the cover of the book, which
quite brutal.
And I sort of get the sense that no image that we produce can be entirely accidental. Like there's almost this desire to see things in a certain way that exists as well. This desire for the European culture to find the savage, to be the image that they thought it was.
Yes. And I mean, this is why Freud's insight is so useful. I mean, he saw in little Hans as being the little researcher because the drive to knowledge is invested in the sex drive because Hans wanted to see the private parts of his parents, but it's also invested in the death drive insofar as, knowledge leads to, the desire, the ever thriving for more, which is the tyrannical impulse, right?
While we're on these sort of notions of the self, this is a little bit myopic and a bit of a tidbit, but I'm interested in spotting this kind of self-reference in how the title of your first collection, Gift and Verdict, becomes a closing line in one of the poems in full foreground. This gift and verdict comes back as not a title, but as almost like a speech act for you.
Yes. Well, I love those two terms, right? Because the gift economy is one that is not invested in the accumulation of wealth, but rather that involves a kind of ways in which the gift has to be can never be repaid, right? So that it activates a certain even concept of time that's endlessly sort of creating an indebtedness. And so the idea of generosity and indebtedness is then counteracted by the idea of a verdict in which time or history is seen as a kind of inevitability.
Reduced to a point where something is judged and...
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's right.
Interesting. You've said elsewhere that you feel that maybe you work a bit like a painter does. I'm thinking about even just the title of the book Full Foreground calls to mind the sort of Clement Greenberg kind of idea about abstract painting and activating the flat plastic surface of the canvas. Could you maybe talk a bit about how this kind of, you see your process as existing in the same sphere as, say, what painting does? Unless I'm misrepresenting it.
No. I mean, I like that. I think that's actually true. I think it becomes a little harder to make metaphor about it because I would be obliged to think of sort of markings and using the language of artists, which I'm not opposed to, actually, and very often I ask students to think in terms of the materiality of pigment, volume, lines, and so forth. But in terms of process, which is probably what I'm thinking of, and I think that the New York school and abstract expressionism of even of someone like Ashbery looks to ways in which the field is one in which that is open to establishing areas of coloration and volume, and that the whole is never within the purview of the moment. And so there's a kind of ways in which it's allowing oneself to be in the studio, the way an artist is in the studio, and allowing the kind of the construction by way of collage, which I think is also important for my work, or the allowing accident and sort of visual mistakes to take place on the page that are then later elaborated into a kind of modeling, which I think I'm very invested in that kind of making, particularly in that book that you mentioned in Full Foreground. Yeah,
you just said the word collage there and kind of taking things from disparate sources, and actually in your sort of aesthetic statement in the Angels of the Americlips book, which we have here, you talk about sort of, I hesitate to use the word categories perhaps, but some different kind of sources that you see language being cobbled together from in your poems. Current events and nice juicy scare quotes, journalism, state demagoguery, advertising, ethnographic account, and the pathologies of violence and massacre. Something that in my reading I've come across recently is this idea of that writer Shazbir Puar has, when we talk about intersectionality, still kind of privileges. We need to have these hard and fast defined source categories in order to talk about intersectionality,
right.
Crossing between them, and these things still kind of exist in their power relations at their source. And so Puar talks about the idea of the assemblage, and I'm still working through in my mind as to exactly how this differs, but do you think a great deal about the sources that these sort of collages come from, or are you more interested in sort of the resulting assemblage that kind of happens? It's a very convoluted kind of question, but
I am interested in the sources insofar as I see the kind of art history that I'm interested in and the kind of literary history that I'm interested in looks to something that we might call anthropology, for example,
mm-hmm.
right? The culture concept. But I am also interested in American pragmatism that would say something like, we learn nothing new from definitions of the categories, right?
Right.
But actually by putting them into place, that what does it mean to open the space of the world so wide as to make it impossible to see anything but from one perspective,
mm-hmm.
right? So that by putting various perspective and ways of thinking together, sort of a thinking forward, one is able to perhaps establish a new perspective or a new standpoint.
And I don't know if this is the best poem to exemplify something like this, but while we're talking about the Angels in Americlips book, I thought I'd get you to read another piece from there, which does, I believe, come from your most recent book, Full Foreground.
Yes, great. Yes, and this one definitely goes back to the violence of the colonizing project of the New World. And like many of the poems, in fact, most of the poems in Full Foreground, it doesn't have a title. Not a word of my surrounding, not a half-whispered go to catch the rattled odd of a third concurrent universe unlatched the more you wait. Chalk drawn thick of old around the marred bodies left by the citizen squads our authorities facilitate, fail to prosecute, guilt being therefore, quote, unquote, when physical comfort, when bodily prowess and sovereign shape are rendered command over the meaning of a nimbus once, in sprigs of goldenrod or Indian paintbrush. Chalice, owing to rock crystal and featherwork, ivory, carved in supple limbs, remote gazes and crusty wounds, gold leaf reredos in bellows pyramidal from an organ pipe. An opulence wrought from the nightmare of native oblation of Christian zeal waged on local hands in effigies St. James the Greater made in Goa and the Philippines, or Rose of Lima in a ministry of Indians and slaves fallen victim to epidemic, heroically to God, and in penitential practice so extravagant, cat claws and fish bones across her wasted flesh, as to be the subject of ecclesiastic inquiry into questions of faith, soundness of mind, stretched the length and breadth of his midrib and torso in taut spasms, teeth clenched and lips in a slather of animal darkness in time spent under thickets, our twin intelligence, a forearm and grip in fast strokes around gleam and edge, tips wet with each other, then deeper to a clump of hair and fingers guiding the back of his head, mouth over gloss and curvature, blade indistinguishable from when too slow a swelter released in sounds of whose awe spread soaked along his back and thighs rubbed sleek across the wonder imperfections of form, lips abruptly pursed, to each moan pillowed by the sudden hush of skin, a spirograph, his dark upper eyelids and lashes down his own lips now, in aftermath order and loosable enormity.
Wow. So, we've mentioned earlier that you're also written a lot on the visual arts, and so I wanted to maybe come to that towards the end here. In particular, you have a book called National Camera Photography in Mexico's Image Environment on University of Minnesota Press in 2009. How did you sort of particularly settle on photography as something to write about?
So in those, especially in the latter years of my time in Mexico, I was interacting with many artists, many of them from my generation, but also with some senior photographers, Manuel Alvarez Bravo among them, but also Graciela Iturbide, with whom I later did a road trip through the south of the United States. And I think the language of photography was something both familiar or strangely familiar to me, insofar as my father was a kind of amateur photographer. And it allowed me to think about the actual concrete, there's the contradiction of photography, that there's actually something there, an index, something that is registered in an historic moment, but that is also an interpretation insofar as it exists within a frame. And that interplay between what we actually see and what were the social and historic conditions outside the frame that allow us to sort of view it in the present is something that I explore in the 4 different rehearsals in that book. So it moves from the very important Casasola archive of the Mexican Revolution. It looks at Edward Weston and Tina Modotti in the 20s and 30s, then Alvarez Bravo, and then a very interesting but troubling archive taken on the Mexico-US border of quasi-souvenir photography, or quasi-souvenir photographs of sex workers and their clients in the border towns of Laredo.
I wonder how literal that word environment is in the title, and I think about Mexico as an equatorial place, a place that has a lot of coastline and may very well bear some of the brunt of the climate change that's going on in the world. I mean, the most powerful hurricane ever just tore, or on record, just tore through from the west.
Yes.
How literal is that idea of the environment?
I mean, on the one hand, it was a way for me to think of place and situatedness both in a real space, but then in the space of representation, the space of a photograph. So environment, even though at the time I wasn't quite as conversant as I later was in someone like Marshall McLuhan, who was thinking about, spheres and environments, but someone like Walter Benjamin did talk about the image sphere, and Benjamin was very important to me. So it was trying to find the right spatial term that would include both practices, art practices, bodies, processes, and the way in which they're conveyed in material by material means.
While we're sort of talking about some of your other ventures, you're also a translator from time to time, perhaps?
Yes.
And particularly known, I understand, for translations of José Lezama Lima, who is also an epigraph to one of the sections in Mirrors for Gold. What in particular draws you to the work of Lezama Lima?
So many things. I mean, he's kind of one of these uncontainable authors. As Rabassa translated Paraíso, which is this very dense, Joycean novel. But in the time I was living in Mexico, so many of my fellow poets and peers were, he was a reference point. And particularly the last book, Fragmentos a su imán, which I've translated as The Fragments Drawn by Charm, because I think it opened a door for what's later referred to as the Neo-Baroque. That is, Lezama was interested in looking at the kind of the Spanish Golden Age, but as if to ask, what would it look like in the archipelagos of the Caribbean, and what would it look like as fused with a kind of tropical surrealism, and what does that do to questions of the self and to questions of history? Because in a sense, he's kind of inverting the colonial project, right, by writing it from Havana in the 1950s and 60s. Although the last book, which is a posthumous book, isn't published until '75, And it also is interested in this idea of the encounter. The last poem, El Pabellón del Vacío, or the Pavilion of Nothingness, is about the speaker in Lezama's poem sort of encountering a former self or other versions of the self and activating a kind of the excesses of the imagination. And I think that's what appealed to poets in the 70s and 80s who were coming out of very difficult histories of both in Argentina and Mexico of sort of authoritarian regimes, and the kind of poetic practice that was in conflict or in relation with those authoritarian regimes, and then thinking of other ways of activating a kind of voluptuousness and excess of the self.
Kind of like a nightmarish space. I think about the work of Raul Zurita, the Chilean poet,
for example,
someone who was, I think, actually tortured by the Pinochet regime there, just needing this kind of terrifying, nightmarish space to work.
Yes, so it does go. I mean, Zurita is a good example because I think the range of practice would be from the kind of the horror, as you're describing, Zurita conveys, to a sort of more joyful view of someone like Lezama Lima and others.
Interesting, kind of continuum there.
Yeah.
All right, finally, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask you this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I wonder if there is any new work that you've kind of got in the works at the moment that you're particularly excited about, that you might want to sort of share what you're delving into at the moment, if it's not too much of a trade secret.
No. I've actually already begun to, because I think I like the title of the book in progress, which may be out soon. But I like the untimeliness of these things. Who knows when that soon would be. But it's called Why the Assembly Disbanded. And though many of the poems continue or build on this idea of working with artists or responding to the dream life of certain visual works, one of the other themes I think comes with age, but also looking back at intense communities of cultural practice that no longer exist, and how social adhesives dissolve. And so I'm interested in how many of the poems, either if they activate a current and former self, or they're looking back at particular moments of cultural vitality, what is it about these moments, or what does it mean to be highly aware of the transitoriness of those moments? Much of this was probably inspired by Roberto Bolaño's The Savage Detectives, which when I read was kind of exuberant, was a place of exuberance for me, even though there's a kind of melancholy sort of permeating the book, because as the two protagonists are going in search of the poet who lives in the north of Mexico, and sort of the sort of quest for this forgotten modernist poet, and the second part of the novel opens up sort of transnationally and historically, sort of covering all kinds of ground. There's this leitmotif in which the narrators in the second part, which are not one but sort of many, there will always be a sort of refrain that says, "Oh, Margarita so-and-so, she was somebody who I used to know," or so-and-so is someone who, someone saw him waiting for a train and then he vanished forever. And sort of this idea of vanishing and disappearing is kind of the one of the leitmotifs that unites in some way the investigation, or the kind of questions that I'm asking in that book.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to seeing it sometime. I'd like to thank you for being part of our Oral Histories project, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Roberto.
Likewise, a pleasure.
Thank you very much.